Hello viewers, welcome to another video from 4DIYers, where I help you save money by sharing my vehicle repair videos. In this particular video here, I'll be doing a demonstration on how to replace the driveshaft flex disc and center support bearing on a BMW E39. As always, if you're not a subscriber, then be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to give me a thumbs up. For this video, I'm using a 1997 BMW 540i. This car is equipped with a manual with M suspension, so there may be slight differences with an automatic, and ground clearance will definitely be tighter due to the lower suspension. My car has about 260,000 kilometers, so it's hard to say if the flex disc or center support bearing has ever been replaced. So this can be done in your driveway. It's definitely a tight space to work, but it's possible. I made some ramps for the front of the vehicle out of scrap wood and managed to get an extra 3 inches of height. The rear, I'm using just the standard drive-on ramps. Getting into it, as you can see, here's the flex disc, or also known as the Giubo. I'll explain a little further into the video as to what a flex disc and center support bearing will cause. I will only be dropping down the exhaust and not fully removing it, but you can remove the exhaust fully if you wish. The heat shields do need to be removed. First, start by removing the 4 13mm bolts holding on the center support for the exhaust. For the most part, I'll be using a 3/8 drive ratchet. For the tight areas will be wrenches, and the larger, tighter fasteners will be a 1/2 inch drive ratchet. Next is the 3 exhaust hangers to the rear of the car. As you can see, one is missing for some reason. Next is another directly above the muffler, and then one just behind the resonator in front of the axle. All using 13mm fasteners as well, which can be easily accessed with a 3/8 drive ratchet. Before disconnecting the very last hanger above the muffler, put a jack under the exhaust to support it. Remove the hanger and then lower the system. You may need to remove the plate with a small bolt on the side of the hanger assembly for extra movement on the rubber support. Just to give you a peek at the final hardware, here's the retaining plate with the bolt that holds the rubber support into place, and then the 13mm fastener, which is actually a nut connected to a stud. So either the nut can be removed, or if it's seized, it'll come out with the threaded stud. Remove the small tin heat shield just above the resonator. 2 8mm bolts hold it into place. Next was removing the larger heat shield. The first one is the larger section in the middle of the car. This is held in with 8mm pressed nuts, depending on the age of your vehicle and what it's exposed to. They may be deteriorated, so you may have to buy new versions. The part number for the replacement will be included in the description below. I'll show you the fastener locations once it's fully removed. Remove the side heat shield just above the catalytic converters. These are held on with the same 8mm pressed tin nuts. These also have wires clipped onto them, so be sure to disconnect that as well. Next, removing the O2 sensor connection box. This is held in with 2 10mm plastic nuts. This needs to be done to remove the larger heat shield as it catches up on the wiring. Once the plastic nuts have been removed, then you can remove the covers, and inside there will be 2 connectors, one for pre and the other for post catalytic converters. Careful when unplugging these connectors, they can become brittle and easily breakable. Place a jack under the transmission, jack up the weight of the transmission slightly, and remove the 8 13mm fasteners in the aluminum cross member. There will be 3 13mm bolts on each side, 6 in total, connecting the cross member to the floor of the vehicle, and another 2 13mm nuts, which connects the transmission to rubber mounts. You can also remove the mounts directly from the transmission too. Those nuts can be loosened, the mounts can be left attached to the cross member, and then the whole assembly is slid back as they sit in slots. To give you a peek under the car where the cross member was, here is the main heat shield, which covers the driveshaft support bearing. The smaller shields need to be removed first, then slid forward, and the exhaust will need to be lowered. It's a tight fit, but it will come out. This is the bolt locations once the center support bracket for the exhaust is removed. Here's the smaller shields in front of the larger shield towards the front of the vehicle, the bolt locations, and then where the wires are clipped on. Ensure your wheels are chocked to prevent the car from rolling. I've chocked both front wheels and the ramps also have lowered portions to keep the vehicle in place. Apply the emergency brake, and considering this is a manual, leave it in gear too. We will be applying more force to the drivetrain, which can risk having the car roll. Now to break those bolts between the transmission and drive shaft loose. These are very tight and it's hard to get a breaker bar in there, so instead I'm using leg power with my 1/2 inch drive and 21mm socket. These are bolts with a nut on the other side, so you'll only be able to loosen them first but not fully remove them. It's important to mark the flange with a paint marker to determine its alignment position afterwards between the transmission and drive shaft. It was kind of tough to see the way I had the camera set up, but the drive shaft 2 differential bolts were quite tight as well. Using a 16mm wrench, if you don't have one, a 5/8 will also work, but it's a little tight compared to the 16mm, and then loosen the nuts. It's too tight for a ratchet, so to get a little extra leverage, I used leg power again, pushing my foot against the inside of the tire to get extra force. Before separating the flange, it's also important to mark its position with a paint marker for alignment afterwards. Now jack up the one rear wheel. This isn't a posi differential, so I can rotate the one wheel while rotating the drive shaft to gain access to the top fasteners. When going under the vehicle, reapply the emergency brake for safety as you'll be under it. Lower the car back down and break free the transmission 2 drive shaft bolts, then remove them. For this, I'm using a 21mm wrench on the nut side. This 21mm wrench is from my newly acquired Jumbo wrench set from Mobile Distributor Supply, made by OEM Tools, model number 22120. This is a metric version which comes in 21, 22, 24, 25, 27, 29, 30, and 32mm, made of a drop forged alloy steel with a durable chrome plated surface. Everything comes neatly packed in a green canvas case with a pouch for each size that is clearly labeled and Velcro straps. The link to this product will be included in the description below. Rotate the drive shaft until all the fasteners are removed. Remove the 2 13mm nuts from the center support bearing. These can be easily accessed with a socket and ratchet. Be sure to support the drive shaft with one hand while removing the fasteners with the other. The drive shaft isn't actually that heavy to support in the air. Now to separate the drive shaft of the transmission, it can be stuck in place, but with a little force by hand, you need to pull it back and it can be removed. After that, separate the drive shaft from the differential flange. This can be stuck also. There should be a slot to insert a pry bar, large screwdriver, or a wedge. Once it's popped free, then the drive shaft can be fully removed. Watch, there will be grease in the rear CV joint. Careful with the CV joint, as you may rip the rubber if you put too much force on it. Considering I do have the exhaust in place, it does provide some support for the drive shaft, but if the exhaust is removed, the drive shaft will need to be supported when connected to the flanges, as it may put excessive force on them. Don't lose the seal for the CV joint mating surface either. Pull the drive shaft out of the rear of the car, drop it past the resonator, under the differential. First, I started by cleaning out the majority of the old grease from the CV joint. This is a great preventative maintenance step. Old grease can be filled up with debris and break down eventually, losing its lubricating qualities. Just use some paper towel. Once the drive shaft gets installed, just before it's ready to be bolted back up, I will refill it with new grease. Now moving on to splitting down the drive shaft to replace the center support bearing. First, put reference marks on each side of the drive shaft using a paint marker, just like before. These are balanced, so it's important to bolt it back up in the same orientation. The bolt in the U-joint is an 18mm. You may need to wedge something in the U-joint area to help with leverage. A faulty center support bearing can fail in 2 different ways, either the bearing being worn out or the rubber damper eventually wearing out. With the bearing, you may notice a clicking to groaning sound when driving. This will only happen when the vehicle is moving. As for a failing rubber, this will cause a clunking during takeoffs or removing your foot off the accelerator, or you may notice vibrations when the vehicle is moving. Once the bolt is removed, the drive shaft can be separated at the spline. Mine was a little stuck, so to separate it, I used a dead blow hammer to help assist on the flange. This is a rubber hammer that's weighted inside. A rubber mallet can also be used. only use something that won't damage the drive shaft. There will be a spacer ring on the spline, so don't lose that. I purchased a center support bearing as preventative maintenance, but after the removal it appeared to be on its way out anyway. The bearing is a little noisy, I can feel some clicking, and the rubber is also aged. The exterior metal frame and rubber must be removed first, so we can get access to the bearing for a puller. Use a chisel, punch, or standard screwdriver with a hammer to tap the casing off. Work around the outside evenly so it doesn't become wedged up on the bearing. To remove the bearing from the shaft, a bearing puller is the easiest way. Pick the appropriate size jaws, snug it down behind the bearing, then install a crossbar. Technically there should be a center bolt, but I don't want to damage the threads in the end of the drive shaft. I installed a washer between the two faces, where the spline and the crossbar are located, as a little added protection. Tighten the bolts and slowly remove the bearing. You may need to tighten the jaws down as you go. Just to give you an example of what the old bearing sounds like, as mentioned earlier, it was definitely in need of replacement. Use about 600 grit emery paper to clean up the surface. Any buildup should be removed easily. I've also cleaned up the spline with a brass wire brush to remove any baked on debris so it assembles easier. Then wipe clean with a rag. Here's a comparison between the old and new bearing. For replacement I used a Phoebe. It's important to use a good quality company, otherwise you may have premature failure. Ensure the new part is the same as the old part, then it's ready to be installed. The open portion of the rubber, the side that the bearing installs through, must face the transmission side of the drive shaft, or the same orientation as it was removed. To install the new center support bearing, it's best to use a large socket or a pipe which will fit against the inner race of the bearing. I didn't have either of those unfortunately, so I took my time with a blunt punch around the outside perimeter of the inner race. Light taps evenly around until it stops and it's tight against the opposite side. Install the spacer, and then reinstall the drive shaft, aligning up the original paint marks. If the alignment is incorrect, you may have a vibration issue once everything is back together. Clean up the bolt with a wire brush and apply some medium grade thread locker and reinstall it. While it may be hard to get a torque wrench in here, you can use a crowfoot and calculate the adjustment for the offset from the torque wrench. It is 72 foot-pounds or 97 Newton meters. Next, installing the new Giubo. I'll install this first in the drive shaft as it's easier to tighten rather than being under the car. When doing this, the exhaust does need to be dropped down as far as possible, otherwise there isn't enough room for the diameter of the flex disc. It only goes in one orientation. There will be arrows on the perimeter. One way they point to the transmission flange, and the opposite way they point to the drive shaft flange. Clean up each of the bolts and apply medium grade thread locker. BMW does typically recommend replacing these bolts, but you can reuse the old ones as long as they're properly torqued with thread locker. A flex disc will cause vibrations during driving, harder gear changes, and vibrations under acceleration. A flex disc is intended to provide smoother feel when driving. For torque specs, this varies between drive shaft and fastener types. I'll provide a full list and description below. This will range anywhere from 35 foot-pounds or 48 Newton meters to 103 foot-pounds or 140 Newton meters. Now we can move on to reinstallation. Push the drive shaft back into place. Ensure the exhaust is low as it'll go without damaging it. The reason I didn't apply new grease in the CV joint is that it will flex back and forth during installation and the grease may be pushed out. Pack it full of new grease, you'll need to pull it back so the joint has enough space for grease. Use a grease which is compatible with CV joints, not just any grease will work. Install the flange seal, replace it if damaged. Install the drive shaft back into the differential, align the paint marks and install the nuts. Just snug them down for now to ensure everything is seated correctly. I used a medium grade thread locker here as well, just to ensure all the threads of the studs are free of any grease. Install the drive shaft back onto the transmission flange. There will be a dowel that the drive shaft needs to be slid onto. Ensure the paint marks are aligned as well between the transmission and the drive shaft flanges. Clean the remaining bolts and put them into place, apply some medium grade thread locker, and install the nuts. No need to tighten everything right now, we're just getting everything into place at the moment. Now for the hanger bearing, push the drive shaft up with one hand, and then thread the nuts on with the other, but don't tighten everything up. Jack the one wheel, disable the emergency brake, and rotate the wheel so we can install the remaining fasteners. Once everything's been snugged down, then tighten both the front and rear drive shaft flanges. As mentioned earlier, the flex disc torque specs will vary. The differential side on the other hand is 24 foot-pounds or 32 newton meters for the nuts, or 51 foot-pounds or 70 newton meter for torque bolts. Moving on to the transmission crossmember, you'll most likely have to remove the mounts if you haven't already. They have a nut on the top, just loosen that and slide them out from a slot. These only fit into one orientation on the crossmember. There will be small alignment tabs. Install the crossmember. You may need to jack up the transmission to get the bolts into place. The transmission mounts are 15 foot-pounds or 21 newton meters, and the crossmember to the body is 30 foot-pounds or 42 newton meters. Again, I use medium grade thread locker. The center support bearing can now be preloaded. Snug it up, then back the bolts off a touch so we have enough movement. Push the center support bearing towards the front of the vehicle about 5 millimeters. Ensure both slots are even so it's not on the angle, and tighten. The torque specs for the nuts are 15 foot-pounds or 20 newton meters. After that, install everything in reverse of removal. As mentioned before, if you find the heat shield nuts have rusted out, new ones can be purchased and they're quite cheap. I'll include a part number in the description below. Once everything is back together, you will need to do a road test to ensure everything is good. If you do find any vibrations, you may need to make some adjustments and ensure it's tight. For vibrations, this could be something as simple as readjusting the center support bearing as it may not be aligned correctly. You may have lost a drive shaft weight, flanges may not be seated correctly, faulty U-joint, faulty CV joint, or you may have a transmission mount issue. Unfortunately, when replacing the transmission mounts, they should be done with the engine mounts as well, as this can throw the alignment off on the drive shaft. New videos are released every Monday and Friday, so be sure to stay up to date with my video schedule by hitting that notification bell on my channel homepage. Don't forget to leave a comment below letting me know what you think of my tutorial. Thank you for watching.